Hey there YouTube, welcome to Big Mike Beard Wisdom. So today we're tackling the rear brakes, and it's one of those things where it's making a bit of a noise. And I'm pretty sure it's coming from the rear, but I'm not 100% sure. The big thing is that with big old wheels like this, it makes it really easy to kind of see the brakes. The problem is that that pad looks pretty decent right there, but that pad is pretty much gone. So a lot of what I'm going to go over today is going to apply mostly to the GM trucks and SUVs, but there's going to be a lot of tips and tricks for anyone doing any kind of brake job. Now, the biggest thing for me on this one is that with the mileage of it, there's always a chance to upgrade. So sometimes going to a different style, it's pretty easy. For this instance, I just went with what was cheap to get me going on the road, because at some point in time, I do want to actually replace these calipers and the brake lines themselves all in one big shot on all four corners of the vehicle. Just because it's a 2009, this is 2022, things are pretty old. A lot of times, you know, they recommend replacing rubber components after about 10 years. I don't see any cracking in the lines, so these look okay. The hard lines look relatively all right. That junction there, well, this right here is actually the rubber line there. That's fairly rusty, and so is this right here. So right now everything's seemingly okay as far as that goes, but for this I do just want to replace the rotors and the pads today. Now, the little bits of shiny here is never a good thing, because that means we've gone metal to metal. When you go metal to metal, you end up putting really weird scrapes and grooves into the rotors. And it was about a week's time that I heard a little bit of a grind noise that I had to turn the radio off and go, what was that noise? To as loud as the noise is now. So it goes pretty quick from, you know, being not too much pad left to no pad left. And the way a caliper works is that essentially pressurized brake fluid comes down in through here, goes into like this back section of the caliper, and that pushes a piston forward. When it pushes that piston forward, that brake pad, the inside one, is attached directly to the piston, so that makes contact with the rotor. By contacting the rotor, so then the whole caliper more or less slides backwards on these pins in here, which should be free, but a lot of times these need lubed. Either people don't lube them, or it's been one of those things where you just haven't needed brakes in a long time and they've just dried out. But when everything works properly, this will slide back and engage this pad. So normally, this pad out here will almost always have a little bit more pad life than that pad on the inside. So depending on how the caliper and bracket setup work together, there's going to be different ways to disassemble them. So this one, there's a little bolt here that goes into this one here, and then this is an 18, this is a 13, and if this spins freely, so when you go to turn this spins here as well, more than likely it's okay inside of here, and it's not froze up, and it still has a fair amount of grease in there. Basically, you've got these bolts that go in through here. Those go into the little slide bolts. So this is pretty simple. Just take that out and then take it out at the bottom. That'll free up the caliper from the bracket assembly. And then the next thing you want to do is compress the caliper. Now, there's a lot of different things you can do. In some ways, people recommend actually taking the bleeder loose. That way all like the bad, heated up, kind of dirty brake fluid doesn't get pushed back into the system. But for me, all I'm going to do real quick is just grab this backside, pull straight my way, and what that does is it frees up the caliper just a little bit, and I should be able to wiggle this loose. So now the caliper's loose. You get a good look at like the boot on the caliper. If this is ever wet, that's a pretty good sign you're gonna need to replace it. So this doesn't look bad. I mean, it looks pretty rusty. But the boot seems to be intact. And then you can see the pads. You can definitely see plenty of pad left on this pad. This one's toast. Then, with everything still in place, what you kind of want to do is make sure that your slides move pretty easy. If they don't move easy, this is easier to kind of fight with them on the car while they're still bolted up than having to, you know, take them off and fight with them in a vise. So right now both those are pretty good. So now I should be able to just go in, take that bolt and that bolt off, and remove the caliper bracket. And another common trick that sometimes you forget to do is to essentially break both caliper bracket bolts loose while they're still attached. So in case it's really tough, like this one, so I had to get quite the breaker bar, well, long 1/2-inch ratchet in order to do this one. But having both of these still attached means that you're able to apply more force to it without the bracket walking around on you as you're trying to either tighten them or loosen them. And then especially up north where stuff's super rusty, you might have a bolt where it's a fight all the way through. And the reason why is because you've got rust on the other side that you're wearing off the bolt. So you might be in for a fight with them for a bit. Now, if it winds up binding up and almost seeming like it wants to stop, go ahead and run it back in, because what that does is it allows that dirt and the rust that's on the bolt to kind of go back in and fall off. And then you can work it right back out again, and hopefully it'll be easier. This is that bottom bolt that was kind of stuck. You can see the yellow Loctite that was used. And then at the end, you can see all that rust. And then with that off, you can go ahead and take the caliper bracket off. Now you can really get a good look at that inner pad. It's pretty toast. That other pad, not too bad. The caliper can sometimes be a tough thing to get off. Now the rotor is a whole other mess. So depending on rust, this can be one epic battle. So there's certain things, like these bolts here and there, well, both holes are threaded. So if you're in a really, really bad struggle with one, you can run a bolt in there, use it to kind of help press it forward and off of the hub itself. But you can kind of see, here's the outside, fairly rusty ridge up here, which pad-wise, the pad is big enough to go up into there. So more than likely that pad was slightly cocked a little bit. This one, you can see, we got the full metal-to-metal treatment on this backside. And the bad part about it going metal-to-metal is that a lot of times you can't turn that quite right. So sometimes you can turn it and you don't have to replace the rotor, but it's one of those things where you have to have a really, really good machine with really, really good bits that'll be able to take it slowly, slowly, slowly off. And really, if a shop saw that, they're going to tell you got to replace the rotor anyway. So doing this at home by yourself, it's way easier just to replace the rotor. And of course, this rotor is on there pretty good. So what I'm going to wind up doing, taking a hammer, smacking around the surface here, try and break up any rust, and then using this area in here where the caliper was as a striking area to knock this. And then hopefully it's able to get it to move. If not, I'll turn it, hit it again, turn it, hit it again, try and break this loose as much as possible. What happens a lot of times is that there'll be rust inside of here, and then now you're fighting that inner drum parking brake shoe. Beating on that really didn't help any. So I put these two bolts in. These are M10s with a 1.5 metric thread. You can kind of see, as I tighten this up, right there at the axle, that it moves it out. And then you don't want to forget the other side. And she's pretty much loose. So all that hitting that with a hammer didn't really do much, when you can just run 2 bolts in and away you go. That sounded like that was all the way. There we go. And then you can see like the parking brake shoe. So just a simple drum system. You pull the parking brake cable, it expands this out down here. That way what winds up happening is that these contact inside it over here. What we were fighting is this rust ridge that forms in here sometimes and will not let this loose. So depending on the vehicle, if you're planning on using your parking brake, you can leave them in, maybe replace them if they're wore out. This I'm not going to touch, and when I replace everything, I'm actually probably going to just not use it at all and possibly remove it. That way it's one less failure point to have floating around. With the old rotor off, now's a good time to really inspect the new rotor, make sure all the parts look the same. I always put them kind of like end to end. You can see they're the same size, roughly the same width, and then if you flip them kind of side to side and hat to hat, you'll be able to compare this side to that side and make sure that they're the same depth. Then, with the new rotor, that's going to have a coating on it to keep it from getting rusty. You want to clean that off. A lot of times I use brake clean. The world's kind of moving more towards like soapy water, which is, you know, doable as well. So if you've got like Dawn dish soap in a water bottle, you can do that, which is what I currently have in stock. It's just a quick spray bottle. So I'll get this cleaned up real quick. I'm going to clean it up inside and out. And then I'm hoping that once I get this thrown onto there, I won't have to mess too much with the parking brake. So as long as the parking brake's far enough away from it, it shouldn't contact it. I shouldn't need to adjust it. But there's always a chance that somehow this is just a little bit different machining. So maybe it's going to be just a touch thicker, and I'll have to adjust that parking brake to make sure that this goes on nice and easy. I cleaned the face up pretty decent with a Scotch-Brite. Threw a fair amount of anti-seize on there just to help this, help prevent some of the sticking, maybe in the future. Because at some point in time, I'll probably have to take this rotor off again for one reason or another. And it's always nice when they come off easy, as opposed to being a fight. So that pretty much brings us to the pads. And caliper bracket wise, so if you're going to reuse the hardware, I would definitely recommend cleaning it up and then lubing it. Pad wise, you want to make sure the pads match. Which brings me to an interesting point with this. So this was a power stop kit that I ordered that was supposed to be a set of factory replacement pads, so nothing special, and the 2 rotors. For some reason, I got 2 sets of brake pads. One being the Power Stop Extreme Severe Duty, and another one being the Evolution Plus ceramic. So both of these are step up versions of the pads that I ordered. So the nice thing about ceramic ones is that they tend to be low on dust. And then these are pretty cool because they have a rubberized shims on the back. So they should be a little bit quieter. I'm assuming they've got something set up where they got a faster break-in. And it comes with the hardware. So whether or not I reuse the factory stuff, or I can use this. And then this one is the Z36 carbon fiber ceramics. So another step up from these. And then these are the same thing. So thermal scorched for fast break-in and premium hardware. Again. So, it's kind of one of those things where this is what I was looking at upgrading to whenever I replaced the calipers. So now it might be one of those things where, instead of having to buy loaded calipers, which are calipers with brake pads, I can buy just the calipers themselves. But for now, I'm going to go with the cheaper set just to run these as they are. And the big thing is that you want to make sure that they're the right pad and they fit. Because sometimes you can get pads that are supposed to work and they're slightly different shape for one reason or another. So, there's the hardware. And here's the pads. And then to compare the pads, you can see this is the old one that was not full metal to metal. Shape-wise, looks pretty similar. There's a squealer tab on this one. So it looks pretty similar. The cool thing is you can really tell just how much pad there should be on there. How much pad this one wore through. And then what happens if you wait just a little too long. I popped the pins out just so you can get a little bit better look at them. So that top one, the one that moved fine, is nice and greasy like it should be. The bottom one, you can see is rusty. So something must have happened. Either water got into the bottom one or grease ran out and stuff like that. But it's one of those things where you want to clean this up as best as you can and throw a little bit of grease in there. That way this lubes back up. What was more than likely happening was that because this was not sliding properly, when the piston pushed against the rotor and then started to wear the inside of the pad, it wasn't allowing the whole caliper to slide and engage the outer pad. So all the braking was done on the inside, wearing that pad super fast compared to the outside pad. So now I've got the new premium hardware on, lubed it with a little bit of anti-seize. I've got the pads in. You can do the pads, you know, after you put the caliper bracket on the car. But for me, sometimes I like putting it on outside the car, just in case things don't wind up working out quite right, and I've got to like swap out the hardware again, or I got to mess with something. That way you're not worrying about getting anything on the rotor as far as like anti-seize or other lubricants go. This all brings us pretty much to the next point, and that's going to be your brake fluid reservoir. Because when you go to squeeze that caliper in, it's going to move all that extra fluid that it had down in it up into this reservoir, which means it's going to push all the old fluids back a good step. So I mean, essentially the fluid all the way back in that rear caliper isn't going to actually get all the way up to here, but it's definitely going to go through your ABS module and maybe in the lower parts of the lines down here, because there's a lot of fluid in the lines from up here all the way back there. But you want to see about where you're at. So I'm at just short of max. So someone might have topped this off at some point in time. Just to be safe, I'm going to take this loose. That way any residual air may come out. But I don't think that caliper's out far enough to really make that big of a difference. Back here, we now have the caliper bracket on. The pads are on. They're squeezed against the rotor. So you've now got this amount of space that you've got to get that caliper to clear. Right now, that piston's out pretty good. So if we were to try and slide it on, you can see it barely covers up to the rotor, so that's got to get pushed in. Now, depending on what kind of tools you have, there's a lot of stuff you can use to push these in. Depending on the caliper and the vehicle that you have, you may have to do some special stuff. So this being on a GM, and there's nothing right here that looks anything special, this is a simple one that you can squeeze in without needing anything special. So if you got a big C-clamp, you can use a big C-clamp. I'm a big fan of big old channel locks. So, but if you've got one where it's like a cross shape or two dots on the side and stuff like that, it might be one where you've got to push it in, turn it a little bit, push it in, turn it a little bit, push it in, turn it a little bit. Luckily, I don't have that. So the old Miatas kind of had those. Various other kind of like smaller cars had it. A lot of times if you've got a parking brake built into your caliper, that'll have that kind where it's, I mean, essentially that way it knows how far to be out in order for the parking brake to work properly. But This case, parking brakes in the drum. This, good to be squeezed in. And really just set the channel locks to big enough and squeeze it on in. So you can see quite the difference in how much that moved. So this rear section back here, where the piston moves and seals and stuff like that, all that fluid just got pushed back through the lines. And let's see where the master cylinder is at. Alright, so the master cylinder is just slightly above max now. So you can see a fair amount went back through. It's not like a ton went back through. And then whenever we go and pump the brakes up to make sure that the pads and the calipers fully seated, this will go down a little bit more. But I also have the other side to do, so who knows where it's going to be in the end. I am a kind of clean looking brake lubricator. So I put anti-seize on the caliper itself where it touches the pad, as opposed to putting anti-seize all over the front part of the pad. So this way, just where the caliper touches has the anti-seize on it. So that'll help keep you wasting any product in between here, or having silver anti-seize showing where you don't really need silver anti-seize showing. But on the inside, I do wind up lubricating the pad itself, because who knows where exactly that caliper piston's going to wind up landing. And I always like that to have at least plenty of lube on it. So now I've got it back in place. We can go ahead and throw these bolts back in. Now that I've got that tightened up, you can kind of see the caliper's got a little bit of a wiggle to it. So that lets you know that the slides are working pretty good. And I've got a little bit extra space in here. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and pump the brakes up. That way it removes any of that extra play that might be in there and brings that piston back out. That way the pad's as close as possible to the rotor itself. And really, when you go down the road and you hit the brakes, it pressurizes that line and squeezes this. Then as soon as you let off the brakes, it's more or less, there's nothing that actually retracts it. It's just that now there's less pressure there, so the rotor itself kind of helps push everything back into place, or says, hey, get off me. But you definitely want to pump the brakes after you do every brake job. The only brake job I ever didn't do was my last brake job that I did at the dealership. After I put in my 2-week notice, they had me go ahead and just work it out. And then the last day, I was doing a brake job, and then I had to do an alignment, put the car down, kicked the lift arms out, went to back it up, and then suddenly realized I didn't pump the brakes, which you'll have no brakes if you do that, especially if you did a 4-wheel brake job. So that's a hoot and exciting. You got to figure out what to do real fast. And it's nothing crazy. It's just go in there, hit your brake pedal, hit your brake pedal, and then this time that I'm hitting it, I can feel it right up here at the top, so it's good and filled up. And then we may even see a slight minuscule drop in here, but probably not too much, because that piston should have just moved a little bit. Alright, so this is all done. Everything's all back together. Now it's time to tackle this side. And essentially this side, you can see fair amount of rust, just like the other side on the outside of the pad. But on the inside of this one, it's all rust. So that pad down there isn't worn bad enough that's gone full metal to metal, but it also seems like there might be something going on where maybe the caliper itself is stuck, causing this not to move. So I don't even know if this one's actually throwing any braking power at it, or if it's just hanging out for fun. So with this side here being worn, it's definitely doing at least something so that this is making contact and keeping the rust away. But this, to be that rusty on the inside, I would expect at least there to be something on that, so that every time the brake gets hit, that would do something. I've got that caliper off. You can see there's just a little teeny tiny bit of pad left in there. So that's wore pretty good. I'm gonna slide the pad out real fast, because one of the things I didn't talk about earlier is that your pads don't have to wear perfectly flat on the plane. So this goes against the rotor that way. Now, as it gets squeezed, it might cant a little bit, it might squeeze a little bit, depending on which way it goes in. So it's very possible that you could have a little bit of material left up here, but when you view from the bottom, there's even less material. And this might even be to the point that it was starting to go metal to metal down here, even though it's got a little bit of pad left up there. Now, if you're thinking, well, this one's a little bit better, it didn't go full on metal to metal, it's just really rusty, let me tell you, it's a lot easier to just replace the whole thing and be done with all brand new metal, as opposed to, you know, trying to take it somewhere to have them turn it. So in this instance, I had a good deal on those rotors and pads, and an even better deal seeing as I got the 2 boxes of pads. So this is going pretty good in my favor so far. Oh crap, now all the bolts are gonna snap. Oh, and then of course this one, 2 quick little taps with a hammer and off this sucker pops. Didn't even have to use the bolt hole trick. Both sides are done. Pads and rotors are changed. Slides are all lubricated. Pedals pumped up. So does that mean I'm all the way done? Nope. Now, one of the big things about doing a brake job is that you need to either remember to burnish or seat the pads, or in this case they call it a break-in procedure. So for the Evolution Pluses, they're recommending 30 decelerations from 30 to 5 miles an hour, and then leaving 30 seconds in between to allow the brakes to cool. And that could be different brake pad to brake pad. So this one, for the extreme severe duty truck and tow pads, first they want 5 aggressive decelerations from 40 to 10, then 5 moderate decelerations from 35 to 5, and then allow your brakes to cool. So they can be different for each pad, and I always recommend following whatever they recommend. There can be a huge difference in braking between pads that aren't seated yet and pads that are fully seated. So essentially, whether or not you call it a break-in period, bedding the pads, or seating the pads, it's all one and the same, more or less. But you definitely want to make sure you do it, because that can make the difference between going, hey, I stopped pretty good, to, man, I went with this better brake pad and all of a sudden this stuff's not working right. So definitely do it just to make sure everything's all good to go. And then the cooling is a really important part too. So during that cooling phase, what you don't want to do is to be sitting there on the brake pedal. So you don't want to come to like a complete stop, letting it cool with pressure on that brake pedal, because what you can do is you can warp your brand new rotors. Because by doing this break-in procedure, you'll heat up the rotors, and then by leaving pressure there, it can cause a little bit of a warpage to the rotors that'll wind up having detrimental effects in the future. If your brakes are making kind of a funny noise, it can save you a little bit of money, do it yourself. Otherwise, if you don't have like the right tools, you might be better off going to someone else and having them do it for you. But it's definitely one of those situations where I had always wondered about people that let, you know, pads go metal to metal, and wondered how much time frame they had noise-wise. And honestly, with it only being about a week from the, I think I hear a slight noise, to that full-on grind, I mean, that happens pretty quick. So it might be one of those things where you, if you've got just a little bit of pad left and you hear a little bit of noise, so you can get it checked out that week. Otherwise, you're going to be replacing a whole bunch of parts. As opposed to doing something where it's, you know, a little bit more simple, like a simple pad swap, or, you know, getting the rotors turned. So, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll check you next time.